Never before have there been so many of us. Never before has the world been so much in motion, and the global dream of prosperity and a better future so pervasive. Never before has there been so much need for space.
We're living in this period of extreme urbanization right now, particularly when you see what's happening in Latin America, in Africa, in India.
We need to build as many buildings in Africa in the next 15 to 20 years as have been built in Europe in the last 200 years. That's an unbelievable number. We have to build with people in mind. We mustn't lose sight of that.
The biggest problem that we are facing are the issues of division, the issues that come out of inequity.
We have to act now for the sake of our future.
Architects, urban planners, and engineers around the world are looking for answers to some of the most pressing questions of our time. How can we, as citizens of our planet, live together happily in the future? Where is there room for the future anyway? The question of how, and above all, where we will live in the future, inevitably leads us here, to the city. It encapsulates the modern world and all our conceptions of modern life. It is where some of our greatest success stories begin, where new opportunities await. It's a place of longing, made of steel, concrete, and glass.
I think the attraction of cities is manifold. The history of cities is about managing the surplus from the countryside. So when agriculture surplus existed, markets were set up. And then when that became a more regular phenomena, at whichever stage of their history, people began to settle. It was always a place that had opportunity because it meant the wealth got concentrated there. It meant that one service led to another and more job opportunities existed. But really, cities are condensers. Cities are where you can gain anonymity. Cities are where you don't carry the baggage of any social dislocations that you might have experienced. Cities allow you to feel like you can start again from scratch on an equal footing.
The lights of the city, they draw us in from far and wide. Even today, more than half of us live in urban areas. By 2050, it will be almost 70%. Every year, the global population grows by 80 million people. The issue of overpopulation is, first and foremost, an urban problem. When many people dream of the same place, the space for dreaming becomes scarce.
Every condenser has an upper limit of how much it can actually produce productively, both in terms of societal cultures, but also in terms of economy and all of that. We were taught by our teachers that there's nothing like a city being too big. That just wasn't a problem. Cities got bigger, they would have more facilities, they would do more things, etc. But now, suddenly 3 decades later, I come to teach here, and what I'm telling my students is cities have an upper limit.
Boston, Massachusetts, one of the oldest cities in the United States. It is considered an attractive place to live, partly thanks to its proximity to some of the country's most prestigious universities. One of these is Harvard. At the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Indian architect and urban planning expert Rahul Mehrotra teaches about the future of cities. Born in Mumbai, the challenges of metropolitan life have been at the front of his mind since his early childhood.
cities are no longer monofunctional. It's not just a port town. There are 10 things that happen simultaneously. In a globalized world, there are 100 things that happen simultaneously in a city. So the city becomes incredibly complicated in terms of the aspirations that it's trying to respond to. And therefore, design becomes even more critical because those contestations mean you have to resolve them, and space can be a very important aspect in terms of resolving these.
Yet urban densification in the modern era has traditionally looked like this. Countless high-rise residential buildings packed into a very small geographical space. It's the classic image of urbanization in Asia's megacities. But in the United States, many cities are growing outwards, covering ever more land. The fact that urban space is growing primarily in these two ways results from two technologies. The first is the elevator. It has enabled us to live at previously undreamed of heights. The other is the car. It is precisely these technologies that many architects today see as a major problem. The car and the elevator are forms of mobility technology that are more than 100 years old. They are both, one could say, human isolation systems. Just look at Los Angeles. This is the iconic car city. It's extremely flat, extremely spacious. Here we isolate people as much as possible. We separate them from each other in an extreme way. We require them to consume a lot of fuel, and in doing so produce a lot of CO2 and other pollutants. The other extreme is the idea of the vertical elevator city. If we now look at Hong Kong, for example, where the average living space is around 15 square meters, for me, this is the moment from The Matrix when Neo wakes up and somehow pulls the plug. We think it's science fiction, but now it seems closer to documentary. We're almost there. And it's driven by a technology like the elevator, which allows us to stack space vertically and let people hatch in it like chickens' eggs. That can lead to social deprivation. These are fixed ways of thinking in terms of what a city should look like, which I believe we should free ourselves from. I think that planners, investors, politicians, at all levels, should engage in rethinking the city. Max Vitale, an architect from Berlin, has numerous visions of what the city of the future could look like. His designs have names like Babeltown. Instead of showing individual buildings, they show entire neighborhoods, parts of a city that appear lifted straight from the set of a science fiction movie. That's how futuristic his designs seem to be. They ask what the city of the future might look like if we dispensed of conventional forms of mobility, like the car and the traditional elevator. Some of these are provocative images that may look utopian at first glance, but there's nothing utopian about them. Babeltown was simply the idea of how the linear movement of a tram or a train could be turned into a spiral. The same goes for the village. The idea was to see what happens when we have a diagonal elevator, a zigzag movement. We wanted to show how the movement through the space is always the inspiration for the space itself. Just as it is flat in a car city and vertical in an elevator city. That's exactly the same, only other mobility technologies serve as the input and inspiration for the design. Vitale's current concept was also based on this principle. He calls it the urban shelf. A neighborhood complex in which there are no cars taking up valuable space, but where people move from place to place with the help of so-called micro-mobility solutions. which are extremely flexible. Instead of thinking in terms of finished architecture, we're focusing on the infrastructure that makes living together in a neighborhood possible in the first place. This starts with the basic structure and includes the floor, the ceiling, and the load-bearing structures, and the necessary infrastructure for water and electricity. Everything is built like a giant shelving system. Floors are stacked one on top of the other, with the shelves filled in between them. There are no individual buildings, but rather a single superordinate structure. The idea is that these shelves will be connected with ramps for e-bikes, which can then easily ride up the hill, providing access to pergolas and public spaces that are found on the different stacked layers. And in between, there is room for living and working. That's the basic idea. It can be a very flexible way of building. It's not cast in concrete, so it can change over time. Material, function, size. What happens between the shelves is completely flexible. Only the basic structure is built to last forever. There are no high-rise residential towers here or multi-lane highways. As glib as it may sound, Vitale has created his design with people in mind. The urban shelf seeks to provide solutions to the densely populated city of the future, but aims to do so on a human scale. It creates meeting places that we otherwise lack in cities today, not just on one level, but on different levels. People can actually meet and interact on several different levels. And that, we believe, is how we can and must ensure the social sustainability of a city of the future, through social exchange. We go to the city to meet and interact with others. Tempelhofer Feld in Berlin, formerly home to one of the city's airports. It is the largest open space in the German capital. This morning, Max Vitale has converted this space into an experimental laboratory. It is the first step in turning his design into reality. Via an app, a virtual map is created that makes the urban shelf a livable experience. All that's required is enough space and the right vehicle. Max's colleagues provide support during his test drive. Here you can see the path that you can follow. You can also see some neighborhoods or buildings that you can't drive through, but the key thing is the path, which is shown here in blue. If we now project the virtual designs from the computer onto the surface, then we can literally experience them for ourselves by cycling through these neighborhoods and getting a sense of what it feels like. Then we can see if the curves are a bit too tight or if it's a bit too long and straight and therefore a bit boring. That way we can adjust and change the designs again after experiencing it out here in 3 dimensions. Every day, Vitale sees how the need for alternative forms of urban mobility is becoming increasingly urgent. Parts of the heavily congested Leipziger Straße in Berlin have recently seen a speed limit imposed due to rising levels of air pollution. Of course, we don't have the same traffic problems that we see in Mexico City or in India or in other developing regions and the megacities they have there. But even here you notice the fine dust pollution. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we get the cars out of the city? How can cities continue to grow? We also need more affordable living space. There's enough for us to focus on here in Europe. Vitale's architecture studio often works together with companies from the mobility sector itself. These include car manufacturers and elevator builders, such as Audi and Schindler. The industry has long recognized that it can only remain sustainable by providing new solutions. For Vitale and his colleagues, the future of our cities depends on our willingness to rethink established structures. The urban shelf frees itself from the idea of architecture as a design spectacle and instead offers a system-based solution. one that is individually adaptable to any location, to any social structure.
Ich kann mir vorstellen, dass innerhalb dieses Regals gibt
The shelf contains space both for luxury apartments and affordable homes. We studied the idea together with students in Brazil and found that it would make sense to have the basic structure financed with public money to build the essential infrastructure, and then have the people living there build the living spaces within it, their neighborhood, with their own hands. A bit like they do in the favelas already, but within the structure of the urban shelf. That's also what we were aiming for, a certain versatility and visual diversity in the appearance of these living spaces.
Im Erscheinungsbild von diesen Lebensräumen.
In Tübingen, in southern Germany, this dream may soon become a reality. The first urban shelf has just been created here. While not yet a fully fledged urban neighborhood offering micro-mobility transportation options, it will nonetheless provide space for people to meet and socialize. Students and refugees are intended to live here.
Wir sollten das nicht im wahrsten Sinne.
We don't want to create the kind of architecture that separates people from one another or force people to be part of a neighborhood. But I believe that we should at least provide the opportunity to those who want it. Because if we really want to create sustainable cities and happy urban residents, then I believe that neighborhoods are a measure of how we can support social interaction and contribute towards it.
Viel soziale Interaktion auch fördern können und die dazu beitragen kann.
No matter how rapidly they grow, our cities must continue to be places of social interaction. The strength of our communities is an important indication of how well we are able to live together.
The form of the city, the space that we make and we occupy, is critical to fostering the notion of the city as a condenser, the place where there are social interactions that give rise to innovation, and then they give rise to creativity, and they construct and manufacture culture, and the arts come out of it, films come out of it, which is what you and me and all of us thrive on. And again, here architecture can play a big role, or it's creating conditions where there's more polarity. Build a wall, do this, keep people out. There's a polarity, and that polarization process is accelerated.
Seen from a distance, the city skyline is full of promise. But the closer we look, the more it reveals a quite different reality. The centers of our cities have long ceased to be places of community.
In many parts of what are called global cities, of Shanghai, of Dubai, of New York and Manhattan and Hudson Yards, you have tall buildings huddled together with very few lights on in those apartments, because this is just speculative. People have invested from around the world, tons of apartments that just lie empty. 5 lights on a 30-story high apartment. So it's got no relation to people coming there. Its relationship is to the capital that has arrived there. What this does is 2 things. One is that it creates a hyper importance for architecture. The materiality of these buildings are materials that can be deployed very quickly. This dry construction, it's metal cladding, it's glass, which can go up very quickly, because the more quickly the building can go up, the more quickly capital can realize its value. And then the other thing it does is it creates inequity, because then marginalizes a lot of people, because this capital then occupies usually prime space in the city, which has got the best services, which has got where the jobs are. Then you have a complete disjuncture between working and living, and you have massive inequities that play themselves out just spatially, because the poor just get fled to the edges of the city, for example.
A glance at some of the world's largest cities show what, when taken to their extreme, such developments can lead to. From the favelas in Rio to the slums in Mumbai and New Delhi, more than 1 billion people live in so-called informal settlements today. This figure could triple by 2050.
How cities grapple with this is going to be a challenge, because cities are about people living together and working cooperatively. And if you can't live together in a city, you can't have a city. The system breaks down.
You don't have to travel to the developing world to see what this looks like. This problem has long been part of Western societies as well. A stone's throw away from Harvard University is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known as MIT. More than 11,000 people study at this elite university, but they can't live here. While there are plenty of laboratories and offices available, there is nowhere for people to call home.
The decision about land use is captured by international companies or real estate developers that want to maximize their returns. So as a result, in this neighborhood, we have no grocery store, there's no pharmacy, there's no daycare center except for MIT people, there's no healthcare facility. You would have to walk a long, long ways to be able to buy broccoli or a toothbrush. And very few people live here. I mean, what little housing is here is only for rich people. So at night it's completely dead here because it's not really a functioning community. It's not that urban planners don't care about these issues, but that they don't really have the tools to have an impact on them.
Now, researchers at the MIT Media Lab are building these tools. The study group City Science is looking for ways to make towns and communities more livable for their inhabitants through the use of new technology. The group is led by Kent Larson. Previously an architect, he is now focused entirely on research.
One of the applications of technology that we are most excited about is to reinvent the process using technology and the decisions about land use.
Neighborhoods and entire cities can be simulated on one platform. What happens when new homes and offices are built? How does the flow of traffic change? How many inhabitants are too many? Which parts of the city are busy and at what times?
This is Kendall Square, where MIT is. It's a 1 square kilometer district. MIT now has control of 14 acres, this area right here, and they are going to be developing this in the future. It's the last opportunity to turn Kendall Square into a real functioning community. So you can see most of the buildings here are represented by these codes. So O is office and R is residential. So then when we run our simulations, we're taking into account the mix of people of different demographic profiles that might live or work in each of these locations, and we can change those on the fly.
The model has been fed with data sets that allow countless scenarios to be simulated and urban planning to be carried out in an interactive way. The idea is to be able to predict the consequences of planning decisions. The individual components of the model are like building blocks that can be exchanged, which has an effect on the entire neighborhood. Lego bricks are used to simulate the construction.
With this kind of tool, you can have lay people on the one hand who live and work in the community be involved in an interactive way in the process, and you can have the mayor and the staff and the civic leaders be involved in the process. So we think of it as a democratization of design, of putting very powerful tools that are currently only available to experts in the hands of non-experts to engage them in the process.
This dialogue between urban planners, investors, politicians, and citizens is an attempt to meet the needs of those who actually live in the city. The first projects are already underway.
We're working in Hamburg. We used a tool just like this to help them address housing for the refugees. We're working in Helsinki to help them redesign the campus at Aalto University. This model over here is a street in Shanghai near Tongji University. Eventually what we'd like to do is to turn this into an open source platform that anybody could use. I'd like to see it in hundreds or thousands of cities all over the world. You can move it up just a little bit more. This is office, bar is residential, you can see park. And in this case, the other thing is that we had cameras in the street here. It's really critical that urban design, urban planning become more agile, more adaptable in the future. The notion that you can create a master plan that gets passed by a city and that's valid for 10 or 20 years when technology and economic systems and social patterns are changing so rapidly. I mean, it's just an invalid concept. The old ways will never be fast enough.
On its mission to improve city life, the City Science Group is interested in more than just urban planning. Another innovation of theirs, robotic interiors, was also developed at MIT. The scientists are working to answer a specific challenge. How flexible can a single room be?
You go back to Roman times, we still design the same way. The idea is that a space is basically for a single function. You have a bedroom with a bed where you sleep, and a dining room with a dining table where you eat, and a living room with a couch where you entertain. And you end up with all these rooms, and as you begin to shrink the apartment, because there's no choice in the city because land is so expensive, that you get to the point where you can't have single function spaces. It's just impossible.
For years, the students have been working to develop a solution, even breathing new life into office furniture. Their initial prototypes already show that a single room contains a whole lot of space. By means of a light barrier and sensor, the living room turns into a bedroom, while the kitchen transforms into a bathroom. A dining table suddenly appears where a desk had been standing. And now the research project has turned into a commercial startup. It's called Origami Living, from Origami, and it has already raised over $20 million in investment capital.
The transformation and the design of spaces with the appropriate technology allows you to configure the space in an effortless way for whatever function is at hand, and that's a very hard challenge, but we're beginning to make that work. And I think that is the future. I'm totally convinced that in 10, 15 years, every apartment will have this in the city. Urban space is too valuable to be static.
Innovations help us to overcome the challenges we will face in the future. And yet, when it comes to building, we are still not innovative enough to ensure we will even have a future. The urbanization of our planet has led to an insatiable appetite for new buildings. Worldwide, 4 million tons of cement are produced every year. The construction industry is therefore responsible for a significant proportion of greenhouse gas emissions and the use of precious raw materials.
We are running out of resources. As Buckminster Fuller said, we are on spaceship Earth. He wrote a book called A Manual for Spaceship Earth. And what he meant by that is it's got finite resources. As Gandhi said, this planet is enough for our needs, but not for our greed. And I think we've moved into becoming too greedy.
Es gibt auf der Welt heute so viel.
There is such a demand for building materials around the world. For example, in China, more cement has been used in the past 3 years than in the USA in the last 100 years. We are using our resources at a much faster rate than they can be replenished. The same goes for sand. We are consuming more sand than is produced through natural erosion. Sand is needed to make cement, which is why it is so precious for the construction industry. That it could ever run out is hard to imagine. After all, about 1/6 of the planet's land surface consists of sandy deserts. But this type of sand is unsuitable for construction. To make cement, you need the kind of sand where the grains interlock and thereby stick together. This does not take place with desert sand, and so it cannot be used. And that's why the city of Doha, for example, despite being located in the desert, has to be built with imported sand. Qatar imported $6 billion worth of sand into the desert last year. The effects of this multi-billion sand trade are disastrous. The need for building materials is so great that sand is being sourced illegally. Beaches are disappearing. Riverbeds are being dredged so much that their flow rate is changing. All so that newer and ever more ambitious building projects can be realized in the world's major cities. We have to change our thinking. We have to remember that this is the only planet we have, and we want to ensure its continued existence. And that's why we have to consider how we can best use our available resources. And in a small town in the German state of Thuringia, that is exactly what is happening. A new building material called polymer concrete has been created. These bricks could revolutionize the construction industry, as they are made largely of the raw material that has so far been unsuited to building: desert sand. Gunther Plötner and Gerhard Durst are the inventors of this miracle substance. Together, they founded the company Polycare. That seems to make quite a difference. Sand always contains dust particles, which are of no use to us. If I pour it like this, you can see the dust rising. We can't use this dust. The past few years of research have made the two men something of sand experts. They know exactly which weight and size of grain are required for their specific purposes. Their time in the laboratory is spent perfecting the formula of their building material. The sand is sucked into the machine, and a polyester resin, which is a liquid, comes out of a tap. The two are mixed together, and this mixture comes out at the front towards an outlet pipe. At the last moment, we add a hardening agent. It's a bit like baking a cake. You add the baking powder to the cake mixture, and the cake rises. The polyester resin that is added to the sand is a plastic, yet has similar properties to tree resin. This polyester resin moistens the sand and glues it together. What's special about our polyester resin is that it consists of 38% recycled PET bottles. So basically, we're gluing desert sand together with recycled plastic bottles to form a building material that will essentially last forever. The great advantage of polymer concrete is that once it has been applied and becomes solid, it's completely non-absorbent and releases nothing into the environment. It takes about 20 minutes for a brick made of polymer concrete to set. This is unbeatably fast compared to conventional concrete. And it has another clear advantage. The production process requires no water at all and generates significantly less CO2. The result? A Lego brick for adults that can be created quickly and, above all, easily. The idea of producing a construction material came to us after a natural disaster, the terrible earthquake in Haiti in 2010. My colleague Gunther Plötner and I got together and thought about what we could do to empower people to rebuild the island themselves.
Und das war so unsere Motivation.
And that's what inspired us to produce polymer concrete using small machines on site and make Lego bricks from it so that this would become possible. But first, the company is working in a completely different part of the world, Namibia. A place more in need of a revolutionary building material such as polymer concrete is hard to imagine. Not only are there vast amounts of desert sand, but the country also suffers from extreme drought. Gerhard Durst is continuously visiting Namibia to realize construction projects. The humanitarian intention behind the material has not been lost.
Wenn man hier ist, kann man sich gar nicht.
When you're here, it's hard to imagine that in other parts of Africa things are quite different, that there are problems with overpopulation and a severe lack of housing. Here, everything is still spacious and free. The whole continent used to be like that. And the problems that you see today in Lagos or in Cairo will appear in Namibia at some point. There are already people here who live in tin huts simply because there's nothing else. In a small village in the middle of the Mount Echo Nature Reserve, the latest construction site is located. Here, a church is to be built entirely from polymer concrete. Except for the site manager, the workers are unskilled because the construction itself does not require any specialist training.
Dieser Stein hat unten.
These bricks have the same opening at the bottom as they do at the top, and that's why you can simply put one on top of the other and it fits.
Wir alle haben als Kinder mit.
All of us played with Lego when we were children. I think that's why the principle is easy to understand. If children can do it, why not grown-ups too?
Warum sollen das Erwachsene nicht auch können?
The exact number of bricks that will be needed for a building is calculated in advance. This helps reduce the amount of construction waste.
I believe this one is a little bit too high.
Not only that, the plug-in system requires neither mortar nor any other binding agents. To make sure the walls are completely stable, the bricks are also screwed together using these long threaded screws. In just 5 hours, the entire facade is almost finished. Miriam Shikudula is the good soul of this project. Miriam tells us that the community is only getting a new church at all because of the donations of tourists from Germany and America. Their current church is merely a shipping container with door and windows.
It's very small and it's very hot. And when it is cold, it's very cold. There's many people, some they stay outside, we open there, and some people stay outside there. I see the church is very important because if somebody gets sick or have any problem, they will come to church asking for the prayer. Yeah, and you pray for them.
A few hundred kilometers further south, near the capital Windhoek, a new supply of building materials is being produced. For the past few months, the first polymer concrete bricks made directly in Namibia have been created here.
Das ist Polycare Namibia.
This is Polycare Namibia, the first production facility outside Germany. We have a new team made up of 15 women and 15 men from the neighboring shantytown. We've been in production here since February and are producing enough materials for one new house every day. Sand from Namibia is turned into bricks that look different from the ones we produce in Germany, simply because the sand is a bit different. We get to see the houses that are built here, how the people live in the houses, and how it changes their lives. We also see how the lives of our workers change. That's what's so great about it. The shanty towns on the outskirts of Windhoek. More than a third of the Namibian people is said to live in such makeshift settlements. And yet, a house made by Polycare has already been built here. Previously a model house presented to the Namibian government, the company has since donated it to the Philip family. Before that, their living conditions were quite different.
It was small, we didn't have a kitchen like this. So we mostly used to do our cooking outside the house.
When the rain, they will come, it's going straight inside. They destroy the TV, everything. It's not good house.
Everyone just is dying to have a proper house. As you were coming, you could have seen on the road that most of the houses here are just made of iron, these iron houses. So they all want to have proper house, a decent place to put their head, and yeah, a place where they can call a home.
With the help of government and private funding, Polycare wants to offer many more people the chance to live in homes like this. Their initiative is finally off the ground, and it's now high time to scale up their building plans.
At
the moment, the construction industry is focused on the market for expensive or high-end building methods. This makes no sense. In every country in the world, we have problems building enough social housing. And if we don't deal with this challenge, our problems will only increase. The challenges we will face tomorrow require new solutions and new ways of thinking, especially in the fields of planning and architecture. Paris. During its storied history, the city has produced many important architects and buildings. They have made the French capital one of Europe's most beautiful cities. Today, a new generation of architects is emerging. At the Confluence Institute, they are learning why architecture must open itself up in order to change the world.
In architecture, it's important to think about philosophy, politics, business, sociology, geology, geography. All of these disciplines play a role in what the architect has to do, and all these fields must come together to inspire the architect's designs. Architecture is a culture that absorbs and transforms things to allow something new to emerge from them. Anyone who has studied architecture can design something, but the challenge lies in bringing all these disciplines together. And that's what we're focusing on here. After all, people who have studied architecture should be in a position to change the world.
Odile Deck has taught at various architecture schools and universities. But she often found the way architecture was taught too rigid, too conservative, too theoretical. So she decided to found her own school of architecture and pursue the questions that interested her. What is the role of the architect and of architecture today? And how can they solve the challenges of the future?
There are some architects who carry out data research. They take data sets and use them to analyze the location, the environment, or the city, and then determine what people, in effect, what the customer needs, without ever bothering to meet the people they are designing for and getting to know them. The human dimension has completely disappeared in architecture. That's actually what I regret the most. And that's why I think we need to bring the humanistic idea back into the training of architects. When constructing a building, you have to deal with the person you are working and designing for. You have to understand their wishes, because their wishes are the basis of our work. Unfortunately, this is rarely talked about in architecture schools today.
How these wishes can be incorporated into architecture as directly as possible is the subject of Joséphine Borrat's master's thesis. Her concept allows the shape of a building to be determined by the brainwaves of its inhabitants. In Joséphine's thought experiment, the architecture even changes as the brainwaves change, thus reacting to the inhabitants' emotions and needs.
The idea was to ask what would happen if the human body and architecture had some kind of common technological DNA. We are rethinking how we will build and live in buildings in the future.
Using a 3D printer, the geometric shapes created by the brainwaves are translated into real models.
The principle works. Nowadays, we can gather brainwaves and transcribe them into geometry. Of course, we're not able to interpret brainwaves and to say what someone is thinking or feeling at any given moment. But we can collect clues about a person's sensations, feelings, or impressions. The idea of this project was to question our future role as architects. It's about bringing together a range of disciplines and realizing projects that touch not only on one aspect, but on several aspects of a field, from neuroscience to urban planning.
The students' designs could sometimes be mistaken for modern art. The young architects experiment, dream, find unusual perspectives. Often it seems less about the feasibility of a design than about the idea behind it. What would it be like to live on the moon?
If our profession only requires us to follow rules and design buildings that comply with the regulations of the day, then the job of an architect will eventually disappear. If architects, or as I prefer to say, people who studied architecture, because not everyone necessarily ends up becoming an architect, have a vision of the world, a viewpoint, and are able not only to do their job, but also to imagine the future, then architecture will continue to play a role in the world. We must start thinking about tomorrow, today, and act now for the sake of our future. When I teach, I always tell my students how much I envy them, because they belong to a generation that is about to reinvent architecture for the next 100 years. Isn't that fantastic?
Designing how space will be used in the future has never been more important. It's a daunting task because so much is at stake. How and where we will live together in the future will not only be decided by architects, urban planners, and engineers, but they can play their part in ensuring that this where and how will continue to exist at all.
I think those problems come to us with every project, but we choose not to see them. We choose to make architecture the autonomous object. We seem to take the brief only from the client, while we also have the responsibility for society. We are responsible to our patron because they're supporting us, but we are responsible to society because we are going to make an implication for them. So we have to expand our ambition as architects, to expand the agenda, be clever about it, and be respectful and honest about it. And I think pedagogy has to do this. We have to teach young architects this, and we have to demonstrate this. And we have to talk much more about it. That's a very good way to begin.